Friedrich Nietzsche, who was a famous philosopher, one of the most famous philosophers of our time, at least, put forth this proclamation that he said, God is dead, right? That's what he's famous. He's known for saying God is dead, and we'll never wash away the blood on our hands because of that death, us, the murderer of all murderers, something like that. And since that death, essentially what that means is that we've lost our fundamental orienting principle and hierarchy of values because the personality born of the post-enlightenment personality created this scientific criticism which served great purpose in the sense of new scientific discovery and technological innovation, but it, from a psychological and spiritual perspective, hurt the collective in that we lost our guiding principle. And Nietzsche basically made a proclamation that would go two ways: adoption of totalitarian doctrine and a descent to complete nihilism, a hedonistic nihilism, kind of the George Orwell 1984 or the Aldous Huxley. I haven't actually read Brave New World, but that's sort of what's pointed to with the hedonism. Infinite Jest as well. I haven't read that either, but I know I've seen that pointed to as this fall into a hedonistic, nihilistic personality. So to me, I see three solutions happening, and this kind of ties into this end of an era. And those three solutions are one that Nietzsche put forth, which is an explicit creation of our value structure. Now, I don't actually think that's possible, and that's through reading Jung. And I think that the issue with trying to put together a explicit value structure is that, well, here's a good example. We do things that we don't like about ourselves all the time. So who's to say that we can just write down principles of how we should act and then obey those principles? In fact, I would argue I use an example in the piece of this overindulgent nature I had in me. If there was a point in my life where if anytime there was a meal in front of me, I would just clean the plate. If there was 15 burgers in front of me, I would just have a hard time I would have a hard time stopping myself from eating. I just loved overindulging. Probably one of the biggest problems was just being a glutton. I had this impulse to constantly overindulge. And it wasn't until I did a lot of inner work and sort of had this I sort of had this revelation in my unconscious as to what the impulse was coming from, which for me happened to be this impulse was tied to a attempt to mute authentic expression out of fear, something like that. I'm not articulating that as well as I could be. But the idea there is that I had reminders set up in my phone. I would constantly tell myself, just stop, just stop. I sometimes would have the thought in my head and I would hear sort of the conscience, and I'd hear myself saying to myself, hey, you're not hungry. Why are you still eating? Why are you still spooning the peanut butter jar? And the idea is that just because we explicitly define a value structure, one, it's not even clear that we could actually obey the rules that we just explicitly set out for ourselves. In fact, I would argue it's the opposite. People do things that they don't want to do all the time. They'll do them and then think to themselves, why the fuck did I just do that? Why did I say that? Right? It's not easy to just tell yourself to do something and then magically start doing it. That's one problem. I think the second problem is it's hard. Okay, so I guess the process of moral and behavioral discovery doesn't first come from an explicit discovery. It first comes from story and drama, and art. Story, drama, and art are ways that we uncover interesting modes of being in the human experience before we explicitly start defining those interesting modes of being. So, with that being said, I don't think that option one is possible for those two reasons. So then we go on to option two. Option two is the readoption of traditional structures, traditional gods. So this is like a return to Christianity, a return to Islam, a return to Judaism, our traditional structures. I think this is a better solution than one. The problem is that the problem is the integration of newness, sort of what I pointed to earlier. These religions notoriously have difficulty integrating new ideas because they're so tied to the tradition. And I think in modern day, this is how I've always viewed sort of these religious structures, is that they've been misappropriated and corrupted by institutions. The structures themselves and the ideas in the Bible and the text of the religions themselves, I think are beautiful and point to very great ideas. And in fact, I've always taken this modular approach myself to sort of review these and use them as guides along your journey. But I think that we've seen that the institutions have taken it and, in a sense, kind of the institutions themselves have become corrupted and have become too intertwined with the narratives themselves. If you say that you adhere to a specific religion, you're tied to an institution. But in fact, I think that the teaching should be what's integrated into a personality and pursuit forward. So I think option two works, but it's that integration of newness. So it would have to be like an option two, but with sort of reintegrated institutions, or sort of a kind of what Elon Musk is doing with the US government, in that it's sort of cleaning house and making them more lean and more adaptable to the times. Something like that. Like, we need to integrate what's been learned and integrate the good things that have been learned and do away with the things that are harmful to humanity, whatever that may be. That's going to need to that would be a big discussion that would need to be had between a lot of the people involved. And I think the third option, this is the one that's super interesting. And this is another one that I sort of grabbed from Jung and I'm thinking a lot about, which I talk about in this piece. And I think that's the uncovering of new myths. Now, if this is the first time you're hearing this, there's a fascinating one here, which is the UFO UAP myth. So, I mean, if this is the first time you're hearing this, this will probably come as a big surprise to you. But along with a lot of UFO and UAP experiences, people have religious experiences as well. And there's actually this historian of, I believe she is a Catholic historian, and she's a doctor, Dr. Diana Pasulka, who wrote a book and did a lot of research, I think starting 2008, 2012. I forget the exact date, but she's been on Joe Rogan. She's done a lot of interviews. She's written books on this. And she essentially saw in the archives, as she was studying archives of Catholic writings and experiences, she was being reached out to, I believe, by scientists and people a part of intelligence communities about the idea of these beings visiting, angels and demons visiting the individuals as part of the Catholic tradition. And essentially, it's kind of viewing UAPs and UFOs as a religious phenomena, which is, I mean, when I realized, or when I heard that perspective, it absolutely blew me away. That sort of put me on I'd always been really interested in the UFO UAP phenomena, and I always thought there was something to it. I think that put me down the rabbit hole, because that resonated as completely true, in that I think that we might be seeing the birth of a new myth, a new religious myth, and I think we might be living in it. And Jung, actually, so interesting. Carl Jung wrote a book about the UFOs from that perspective. I think there's a great quote from him, which I have coming out, and I'm currently thinking about this and writing about this, but the UFO UAP as a myth. And he had this great quote that like we have this golden opportunity to see a legend being formed, and it's completely amazing to kind of see that play out and what that means and how we evolve in that. So UFO UAP is one that I think is clear is a potential legend myth being formed. And when I say myth, I don't mean a false story, right? The UFO UAP thing might be real, but it's so unbelievable that if someone were to read it in 3,000 years, read a text about it in 3,000 years, they would say, "Oh, that's nonsense." Um, but it's just such an anomalous event that it we tie or unexplainable event that we tie mythic perception and mythic idea to the occurrence of this happening.